another narrative has got out there. That is the claim, a claim that ignores all the actual evidence, that insists that our whole history is a pro-Western whitewash, and that it is therefore the job of anyone committed to justice to overturn this narrative. And so, just as the realities of race in the modern West are put through this distorting projection, so the reality of how our history is taught today, and what our history was actually like, are put through an identical distorting effect. The effort to do this is now going on at the highest imaginable levels. Reframing our history. There have been many efforts to rewrite the history of the West in recent years, but few have been as high profile or as pronounced in their intent as a project launched by the New York Times in August 2019. The 1619 project could have been launched by any number of institutions, such as a university. But for it to be launched by a newspaper, and one which is still sometimes referred to as a paper of record, is highly unusual. For the project was not a piece of reportage. It was an attempt to reframe and rewrite the founding story of America. That wasn't what critics said about it. It is what the project's founders said about their own project. The project was launched with a 100-page special edition of the Sunday magazine. In her introductory piece, for which she subsequently won a Pulitzer Prize, Nicole Hannah-Jones made the bold claim that the date of the arrival of the first slaves on the continent should be regarded as the true founding date of America. The introductory paragraph read, "The 1619 project is a major initiative from the New York Times observing the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. It aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of our national narrative." Hannah-Jones, who is a reporter, not a historian, repeatedly made this claim about 1619 being our true founding. In January 2020, she told an audience at Ann Arbor that our true founding is 1619, not 1776. And in a conversation with Jake Silverstein, editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, 2 months after the project's launch, Silverstein said, "We sort of proposed the idea in a variety of ways that if you consider 1619 as the foundational date of the country rather than 1776, it just changes your understanding, and we call that a reframing of American history, like you're moving the whole picture over to a new center point." As might be expected, this claim caused a certain amount of pushback, and, in response, a number of strange things happened. Within a year of the project's launch, Hannah-Jones herself claimed that she had never said what she had been saying since the launch. "The 1619 project does not argue that 1619 is our true founding," she claimed. Though it might be noted that her Twitter banner still had a picture of 1776 with that date crossed out and replaced by 1619. Still, she insisted that the only people who had made this claim about her project's aims were the right. Yet there it was. Or there it had been. For, as the controversy grew, the New York Times silently edited the web pages in question, so that this especially inflammatory claim no longer appeared on them. The words understanding 1619 as our true founding, were quietly removed. And, after they had done this little bit of erasing, the paper's editors then went about pretending that they had never said the words that they had in fact said, or that when they had used the words, they had used them in a way that had a different meaning than the usual meaning such words had. Jake Silverstein, for instance, wrote that what the project was trying to explain was a rather complex idea, and that when they had said that 1619 was the true founding date of America, they had in fact intended it as a metaphor. In a generous act of self-backpatting, he noted that some critics had said that this metaphor of his offered a clearer vision of American history than had previously been available. Silverstein then did a little rejigging of his own. In his introductory essay, published in August 2019, he had written, 1619. It is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, we were to tell you that this fact, which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, is wrong, and that the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August of 1619? Soon, the online version of this, too, was silently edited. Specifically, the words, "This fact which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July is wrong, and that the country's true birth date," were deleted. Perhaps Silverstein wondered for a moment whether to pretend that the words "is wrong" was also a rather brilliant metaphor, also praised by many critics. Instead, he fell back on something else, which was claiming that the changes to the text were so minor as to be immaterial. In fact, it is hard to think of anything that could be more material than the question of when a country, specifically the most powerful country on earth, was founded. The editors at the New York Times ought to have expected that every inch of ground involving the 1619 project would be fought over, because the project was more than a reframing or a rewriting. The project was a deliberate transposing of American history into a minor key. The move of the founding date was not just about proving that everything that made America exceptional, including its economic power, its industrial power, and its system of democracy, had come out of slavery. It was intended to formalize the idea that the USA was founded on an original sin. It sought to turn a tale of heroism and glory into one of oppression and shame. Perhaps the authors of this project did not expect to get so much attention, or failed to imagine that they would dominate the nation's discourse at such extraordinary speed. But that is what they did. Within living memory, the story of America had been one of a great leap into glorious liberty, led by some of the most remarkable men of their or any age. Now, instead, the American story was rooted in a crime that could apparently never be alleviated. If the authors thought they would get away with this unopposed, then they were wrong. But, given the audacity of their efforts, they might have tried to be a little more careful with their claims. Because the work in question was so shoddy that it did not even try to hide its exclusively political aims. A historical study of the many difficult aspects of American history can be easily recognized. That would seek to take complex junctures in the round, It would survey individuals not through the prism of a single phrase or action, but through an understanding of what they did throughout their lives. It would look at the circumstances of the time, what other countries and cultures were doing at the same moment, and much, much more. Hannah Jones and her colleagues clearly had no desire to do this, and would have been unqualified for the role even if they had aspired to it. For instance, in her introductory essay, Hannah Jones made the claim that one of the primary reasons that the colonists wanted independence from Britain was that they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. She cites two pieces of evidence from 1772 and 1775 to justify this claim. The first of these was the British legal case Somerset versus Stuart. But it is quite bizarre to pretend that a British legal case that had no reach in America was one of the major reasons for America's independence. Even stranger was to do so while presuming that the reasons for independence, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, were unimportant. Until now, the reasons for independence given in the Declaration of Independence had been thought to be suggestive, at the very least. For the 1619 project, they were not, and so its crack team set out to ignore the historical record and scour the land for anything that could accord with their own preordained theory. Even worse among the opening essays in the newspaper's project was a piece of work by a sociologist called Matthew Desmond. Perhaps it was inevitable that a sociologist trying to write history would make as many historical mistakes as Desmond did. But what was even more inevitable was that he should have used his contribution to attack capitalism. As the headline read, "In order to understand the brutality of American capitalism, you have to start on the plantation." The ensuing work attempted, ineptly, to smear capitalism as a whole by claiming that its sources lay in slavery. For example, at one point, Desmond attempted to draw a clear line of association between modern corporations and slave plantations. This is how he did it. "Everything in modern corporations," Desmond wrote, "is tracked, recorded, and analyzed via vertical reporting systems, double-entry record-keeping, and precise quantification." According to Desmond, many of these techniques that we now take for granted were developed by and for large plantations. To put it politely, this is a wildly ignorant argument. Desmond offers no evidence that the plantations were the places where these techniques originated, and that is because there is no such evidence. If the New York Times hired anti-capitalist had a wider historical purview and a less dogmatic anti-capitalist standpoint, he might have noticed something else, which is that many successful enterprises across history share the attributes he describes. After all, could there be a reason why a system in which things are tracked, recorded, and analyzed might work better than a system in which things are, for instance, lost, ignored, and forgotten about? By now, Desmond had the wind in his sails. His anti-capitalist critique continued. "When a mid-level manager spends an afternoon filling in rows and columns on an Excel spreadsheet, they are repeating business procedures whose roots twist back to slave labor camps." Indeed, such a line would have to be very long and very twisty. For the mid-level manager could also be said to be doing something that careful bookkeepers have done throughout history, as far back as Pharaonic Egypt and the Mesopotamian Sumerians, neither white. Occasionally, The 1619 author tries to summon up someone who will support his assertions. Just about the only person he can locate is one Caitlin Rosenthal, the author of a 2018 book about slavery. Desmond cites her in his defense, but fails to note that his own source says, "I did not find a simple path where slaveholders' paper spreadsheets evolved into Microsoft Excel." In other words, Desmond cites a source that says the opposite of what he says to justify his case. Elsewhere, he misunderstands his sources, misquotes statistics, and fails to note a somewhat central fact. The plantation system was not a capitalist system. It was a feudal one. But people who hate the West always hate Western capitalism, and are willing to praise or turn a blind eye to the failings of any other economic system so long as they can portray free market capitalism as simply another arm of Western colonialism and oppression. It appears that Desmond's assignment was simple. It was to smear the capitalist system. Hannah Jones and the New York Times wished to portray everything in American life as having been born in the original sin of slavery. And Matthew Desmond was simply hired to do the hit job on capitalism. But everything else in the project was equally assertive and equally ill-informed. According to Hannah Jones, America was not even a democracy until black Americans made it one, which is the sort of assertion you might make at a rally, but not one normally associated with a historical project, even a historically revisionist project published by a newspaper. Understandably, this all eventually became too much for some actual historians in the relevant fields. A number of leading scholars of American history, Sean Wilentz, James McPherson, Gordon Wood, Victoria Bynum, and James Oakes, wrote to the New York Times to object to the project. While applauding all efforts to look into history, they complained that, on matters of verifiable fact that cannot be described as interpretation or framing, the project had got its history severely wrong. The historians said that the 1619 project reflected a displacement of historical understanding by ideology. From all political sides and none, the corrections to the 1619 project began to pour in. In an interview with a socialist website, James Oakes of the City University of New York made an interesting complaint about the project from the political left. He complained that the worst thing about the project's propagandizing was that it leads to political paralysis. It's always been there. There's nothing we can do to get out of it. If it's in the DNA, there's nothing you can do. What do? Alter your DNA? As well as moral objections, errors and dishonest summaries in the 1619 project kept being identified. But still, the New York Times stuck by its project. Too much had been invested in it. The paper of record had decided that it was going to change the record, whether the historians agreed or not, and whether the facts supported them or not. This was neither journalism nor history, but a political campaign. Unable to answer any of the criticisms of her project's basic historical flaws, Hannah Jones retreated into two moves. One was to lash out. On Twitter, she derided white historians and LOL'd at the idea that they produce truly objective history. When someone described McPherson as a preeminent historian of the Civil War, she replied, "Who considers him preeminent? I don't." After this, she went for the wounded maneuver. She complained that she had not been contacted by any of the scholars privately, and insisted that if she had been, she would have taken their concerns very seriously. Instead, she said, there had been kind of a campaign of getting people to sign on to a letter that was attempting really to discredit the entire project without having had a conversation. By this logic, of course, it might be said that all Americans should feel wounded because Nicole Hannah-Jones had rewritten their country's birth date and was trying to rewrite the nation's entire history, and had done so without really contacting anyone beforehand, let alone anyone who knew what they were talking about. But the most interesting thing that happened with the 1619 project was what happened when it moved from the page onto the street. In June 2020, when protests and riots followed the killing of George Floyd, the New York Post ran an opinion piece saying, "America is burning." It described how rioters had already set fire to police stations and restaurants, had looted shops across the country, and were now coming for statues, including George Washington's, which had just been torn down in Oregon. "Call them the 1619 riots," the author wrote. Hannah-Jones noticed this and took to social media to accept the compliment. Call them the 1619 riots? It would be an honor, she said, as the country was burning. Thank you. The 1619 riots. Just as it is striking how swiftly obscure ideas can spill out from academia, so it is striking how swiftly ideas pumped out in the media can make their way onto the streets. Around the time that the 1619 project came along, America was clearly ripe for a reframing by those opposed to nearly every aspect of its founding. In 2020, a survey showed that by that year, 70% of self-identified liberals wanted to rewrite the US Constitution into one that better reflects our diversity as a people. Basic tenets of American history that right and left had agreed on until now, and which had for generations united Americans of every background, were suddenly subjects of fundamental disagreement. Nowhere was this clearer or more visceral than in the spate of statue toppling that burst out from the summer of 2020 onward. For in no time that movement shifted its attention from contested figures in American history to every single major figure at the heart of the American experiment, from the founders onward. It started at the contested margins with the Confederates. In the days that followed the death of George Floyd, the city of Birmingham, Alabama, removed a Confederate monument erected 115 years earlier. In Alexandria, Virginia, the authorities removed the Appomattox statue, erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1889. Across the country, similar actions were taken. The University of Alabama announced that it would remove several plaques dedicated to Confederate soldiers who had attended the school. And in Jacksonville, Florida, after a Confederate statue commemorating the Jacksonville Light Infantry was vandalized, a crew of cranes moved in during the early hours of the morning and took the statue apart. There were not many objections to all of this. Few people wished to defend the maintenance of Confederate statues, and even fewer wished to do so in the immediate aftermath of a horrible, apparently racist killing. But the authorities and crowds that started on the Confederate statues soon found it very hard to know where their iconoclasm should stop. The statues of Christopher Columbus were a major focus of their ire. though this was hardly the first time that the explorer had been in the sightline of anti-Western activists. During the 1990s and 2000s, there had been eruptions of anti-Columbus sentiment in America. But all of this picked up in 2020, with statues of Columbus being assaulted and pulled down across the country. During the great iconoclastic rage of that year, statues of Columbus were either torn down by crowds or preemptively removed by the authorities in Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, Minnesota, Virginia, and dozens of other places across America. As the days went on and the crowds searched for more and more stone victims, they got ever nearer to the holy spots of American history. Within under a month after George Floyd's death, a crowd in northeast Portland pulled down a statue of George Washington and graffitied it with the words, "You're on native land," and "Genocidal colonist." They also marked it with the letters BLM plus the date 1619. On that occasion, the crowd also set fire to the statue's head, draped it in an American flag, and then set that on fire too. During the same period, a crowd pulled down a statue of Thomas Jefferson outside a high school named after him, spray-painted him with the words "slave owner," and also wrote the name of George Floyd over him. Soon it was George Washington's turn again, with a statue of him being covered in red paint and then torn down in the downtown area of Los Angeles. In San Francisco, it was Ulysses S. Grant who was targeted, with a crowd assaulting the monument to the president who led the Union armies in defeating the Confederacy. And it was by this stage that it looked as though all American history was in the crosshairs. The statue of Spanish missionary Father Junipero Serra was soon torn down in Los Angeles, as was that of Francis Scott Key, the lyricist of the Star-Spangled Banner. So comprehensive was the destruction in some cities that the authorities were frantically removing statues to try to get ahead of the crowds. After assaults on statues of Abraham Lincoln in other parts of the country, the authorities in Boston announced that they would take apart and remove their statue of Abraham Lincoln and a freed slave, which stood in Park Square. While at Hofstra University in New York, the university authorities moved a statue of Thomas Jefferson on the campus in response to a "Jefferson has gotta go" movement. In 2018, the university authorities had rejected student calls for Jefferson to be removed, but a little over a month after George Floyd's death, the authorities removed it of their own volition. One of the students behind the campaign to remove Jefferson said that the removal and relocation of the statue was not enough, but that at least it would stop her parents having to spend sleepless nights worrying that their eldest daughter would be lynched by white supremacist groups validated by Hofstra's decision not to remove the sculpture. It seemed in that moment as though American history in the round was being erased. Statues of Confederates were coming down, but so were those of Union leaders. People who had owned slaves were coming down, as were those who had never owned a slave. Statues of those who were in favor of slavery were coming down, but so were those of people such as George Washington, who came to oppose slavery and freed his slaves. And it wasn't just the founders, but almost everybody who came after them, who was being treated in this way. At Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs announced that it was dropping Woodrow Wilson from its name. Until then, Wilson had been best known for his peace plan for Europe at the end of World War I, and for being the instigator behind setting up the League of Nations. But now, like everybody else, he stood accused of racist thinking. And so the university where he had studied and been president before reaching a higher office decided it had no further use for his name. The death of George Floyd was offered as the explanation for speeding up a consultative exercise that had been going on for some years. A new way of thinking about and looking at America had washed through the country. So much so that the then president decided to give a speech from Mount Rushmore trying to re-establish the American narrative, and doubtless hold it close to himself ahead of an election. But in some ways, what was most striking about President Trump's speech at Mount Rushmore on Independence Day weekend 2020 was not anything he said himself as he rattled through the accomplishments of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt on the rock face behind him. What was most striking was what CNN's correspondent said as the network went live to Mount Rushmore ahead of the speech. Here is how Leila Santiago described the upcoming events. Kicking off the Independence Day weekend, President Trump will be at Mount Rushmore, where he'll be standing in front of a monument of 2 slave owners and on land wrestled away from Native Americans. She went on to report that the president was expected to focus on efforts to tear down our country's history. Santiago appeared not to realize that her own words were at least as suggestive as anything President Trump had to say. For even a couple of years earlier, it would have been inconceivable for an anchor at one of the main networks to use language entirely lifted from the most radical revisionist figures in America. If Mount Rushmore is stolen, then what is the rest of the country? Before the modern era, the whole history of our species was one of occupation and conquering. One group of original peoples were replaced by another group of other peoples. And someone outside the American continent was always going to discover America. What exactly were Columbus and subsequent Europeans meant to do after making their discovery? Should they have returned home and said that there was nothing to see? Should they have kept their discovery to themselves, waited for someone else to find it, or declared America a place with no potential? The ineluctable conclusion of this narrative is that it would have been better if Columbus had never discovered America, or that it would have been better if it had been found and settled by some other more suitable civilization, such as the Chinese or Japanese. But these notions are not just ahistorical. At this stage, they are also completely self-destructive. For if the land you are on is simply stolen, the founding fathers were simply slave owners, then what exactly holds this grand quarter-millennial-long project together? None of this is new. In a period of such rich iconoclasm, it is easy to think that the present anti-Western moment came from nowhere. In fact, it has been bubbling up for decades, specifically since the post-colonial period, when the European powers were in retreat and America was struggling with the problem of how to be a superpower without acquiring an empire. Throughout this period, perhaps it was inevitable that a certain anti-Western attitude would advance. The post-colonial period got off to a variety of starts. In some places, the withdrawal was smooth. In others, it opened up vacuums that consumed everything in the vicinity. But, wherever the case, as the West retreated, anti-Westernism advanced. A correction was due, but in no time that correction became